Hello there everyone, Matt here with virtualinstructor.com, and in this video I'm going to share with you the process of creating a colored pencil drawing of a brightly colored peacock on black paper. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. For this drawing, we'll be working on Strathmore Art Again black drawing paper. This is coal black drawing paper. We'll be using Prismacolor Premier colored pencils, and I'll be sketching things out here with an HB graphite pencil. I'll also use a couple of vinyl or plastic erasers as well as a kneaded eraser, and we'll be using colorless blenders to blend and mix the colored pencil material. We'll start here on the coal black Art Again paper, lightly sketching out the contours of our peacock using the HB graphite pencil. You'll see in these early stages, I'm quite sketchy with the marks that I'm creating. I'm using light pressure here. I don't want to create any indentions in the surface of the paper, which will interfere with the colored pencil applications. So I'm using a very light touch. But I'm drawing dark enough so that I can see the graphite lines that I put on the surface. Now, you want to be careful when you're starting a colored pencil drawing with graphite because you don't want to allow that graphite to mix with the colored pencil applications, especially when you're dealing with lighter colors or lighter values when you apply the colored pencils. For this reason, you want to stay away from using a graphite pencil like a 2B or 4B, since this graphite is softer and more prone to mixing with the colored pencil applications. You also want to stay away from harder pencils like a 2H or 4H pencil. Even though these pencils will make lighter marks, they're more prone to creating grooves in the surface of the paper because the lead is harder. Once we've got our graphite sketch in place, we can start with colored pencil applications. I'm going to start with a terracotta color for the eyes, and I'm starting with the eye of the peacock and working my way outward, since this area is going to be the main focal point of the image. Our eyes are naturally going to go to the eyes of the peacock. And I always like to start the final application of material in the area of the focal point. We're going to work outward from there, adding a large variety of different colors. Here, we're adding a bit of a blue purple. We're also adding some light values. Now, these colors might look like they're white, but it's actually a very light green. In fact, I don't really use much white in this drawing at all because white has kind of a flattening effect, much like using the color black. So it's better to use a very light value of a color so your whites have a hue associated with them. This, again, is that light gray green. Then I'll start adding some of the colors that I see in more of a bold fashion over the top of the beak of the bird here. You can see these purples and yellows and a bit of orange at the tip. Then I'll go back in with the gray-green, softening some of these colors, making the values a little bit lighter and creating transitions between the colors. Now, because we're working on the Art Again paper, there's not a whole lot of heavy tooth here or texture. This means that we're going to be limited in the amount of layers that we can apply to the surface with the colored pencils. However, since the paper is black, it's going to work to make these values dark. And if you look at the reference image, you'll see that there's quite a bit of black or dark value in the image. So it makes sense to work on a dark surface like we are here. For the dark areas in between the colors that I'm adding a bit of indigo blue. So the indigo blue is going to act as most of our dark areas or shadows. This is going to create a little bit of color in the dark area. So instead of using black, I'm using a very dark blue. Now, as we work down the neck of the peacock, I'm going to start adding some greens, and I'm going to make sure that these greens are a little bit more bright and vibrant than what I see in the reference. Again, since we're working on the dark paper, we want to push our colors as bright as they possibly can be on this surface. Now, even though we're limited in the amount of layers that we can apply to the surface, we still want to make the most of the layers that we do apply. So to create complexity in the color, we'll use several different colors that are related to one another, lighter versions and darker versions of colors, and also colors that are analogous to the colors that we're adding. This will create depth in the color, which of course leads to a greater illusion of realism in the drawing. You can see that once we get some of the material on the surface, we continue to layer, and then we build up some of that wax on the surface, which will allow those colors to mix and blend together more like a paint. Once we have the base colors in place, we can add details over the top with a sharp pencil, in this case, an indigo blue. We'll continue with this pattern working down the breast of the bird. Now, you'll notice that the colors that I'm using here are not an exact match to what we see in the reference, and that's completely fine. Especially with colored pencils, it's going to be difficult to match colors exactly in many cases.
Of course, colored pencils are reliant on the pigment that is actually in the pencil. You can do some mixing to a certain degree, but you can't mix colors quite like you can acrylics or oils or watercolor. So we have to deal with the colors that we can actually mix through layering. This may seem like a restriction, but it's actually an opportunity because we can stretch the colors that we see and make them conform to a color scheme if we wish. In this case, I'm adding more purples than what I see in the reference photo in order to create more contrast between some of the colors. The purples and the oranges and the greens will contrast each other nicely since these are all secondary colors creating a color triad. You can see here I'm going back with the indigo blue, creating some shadows and also some additional details. And this process, again, remains the same all the way down to the bottom of the neck of the bird. Now, with all colored pencil drawings, it's important to be patient and allow your layered applications to gradually develop. A lot of new artists to colored pencils work very quickly and use colored pencils like they would graphite. Colored pencils are, of course, a completely different medium and don't behave in the same way as graphite. So we have to be very patient and allow the drawing to develop. In fact, this drawing took around 15 hours total for it to be completed. Now that we have the head, the neck, and most of the breast of the bird complete, we'll switch our attention to the crown of the bird. And here we'll use a lot of the same colors that we used in the head. Purples, blue-greens, and lighter and darker versions of these colors are applied at the top. We'll also use more of that gray-green to create our lighter values, which will give us the impression of these areas being white, but still with a bit of color associated with it. It's important to use a sharp pencil to draw defined lines like this, but a dull pencil is also valuable as well. We'll allow our pencil to get dull in areas that we have to cover larger areas or where we want some blending to occur. Once we have the strong lines defined, we can work into the negative spaces in between them, adding some of the colors that we see behind the bird. Now, this section is blurred out quite a bit, so we don't have to worry too much about the fine details, instead just the fields of color that we see. We'll go ahead and finish the end of the crown on the left side, and you can see that these values are mostly darker here. Again, I'm taking the liberty to add a little bit more purple in these areas just to make the color a little bit more interesting in the drawing. Then we'll go back with the gray-green and again draw these lines that are nice, strong, and defined. In this case, I've decided to add a little bit more pop of color in these lines, so I'm adding a bit of yellow. There's also a little bit of pink and purple that I've added. And then once we filled in some of the negative spaces in between the crown, we can start working on some of the details behind the bird. Now, I say details, and there are details here, but we're going to allow these to be blurred out a bit. So we're going to use softer applications and allow some of the colors to blend into one another. We'll also use the colorless blender here quite a bit to blend or blur these applications. You can see here with light applications, I'm layering lots of different colors in order to create more depth in the color. Each one of these applications is fairly light until we build up enough wax on the surface to create a more solid application. Now, you can imagine if we were working on a white sheet of paper, how much more colored pencil material we would have to apply to the surface. This is one of the clear advantages to working on a dark surface, as we see here, especially with a dark photograph that we're working from. So your paper choice is incredibly important no matter what medium you're working on. Remember, your paper is the foundation for your drawing, and foundations are pretty important, especially when we're talking about buildings and things. So consider your foundation just as important as the material you choose to work with. Some of the lighter values I'm adding here, I'm using a cream color, again, avoiding using white since white can make things look flat. I'm adding a little bit more orange to this area as well. So at this point, I've added 4 or 5 colors in this location and just patiently layering these colors, allowing them to slowly and gradually cover the surface of the paper. Now, with any colored pencil drawing, it's important that your application techniques are consistent throughout the drawing, meaning you don't want to have any areas where the colored pencil material appears lightly applied. Now, in this area, we've applied the colored pencil with a light touch, but we're using the colorless blender now to work some of this material into the tooth of the paper. This will help eradicate the texture produced by the paper, creating a smoother application or a smoother look to the application so that it matches the applications that we've applied in the foreground on the head and the body of the bird. Here again, I'm using the indigo blue to create some of the darker values or more defined lines in this section. And then even in the areas where it fades out into darkness, I'm going to use indigo blue in that area as well. Now working our way a little bit to the right, we'll start filling in some of the fields of color that we see. Again, this is a very simple process. We just need to look at the colors and the shapes of the colors that are created in the photo reference and try to match them in our drawing as close as possible. If you turn off your right brain, your brain that tells you what you're drawing, and instead focus on the shapes and colors and values that you see, drawing becomes incredibly more easy. So it seems counterproductive, but don't think about what you're drawing. Instead, just focus on the shapes of color and value that you see and try to match those as close as possible. You can see here I'm filling in some of the negative spaces, again with the indigo blue. In the end, this entire drawing will be covered with colored pencil material. So all of the dark areas are addressed with indigo blue, and in some areas, 70% cool gray. You can see at this point, we've turned our attention to the highly detailed part of the bird. I'm not really sure what this part is called, but it's basically the transition between the body and the feathers. We've used lots of minty greens, lots of yellows and oranges, and a bit of red in this section. And instead of using indigo blue for the darker areas, we switched and used a dark umber. This dark umber is actually a dark brown, and it matches more with the colors that we see in those dark sections. Then we'll continue working on the feathers behind this section. And as we work back, we're going to allow this section to become a little bit more blurry. So the areas that are further away from the bird are obviously more blurry, but as we work down the picture plane, we're actually working more into the middle ground and the foreground. So as we work down the paper, these sections are going to become more and more clear and more crisp. And the way to do this is simply to have edges that are sharper and also have more contrast. We typically see more contrast, especially in value, with objects that are closer to the viewer. So this is a real good trick on how to create the illusion of space in any drawing, not just a drawing like this. So as you work towards the foreground and get closer, you're going to have more contrast and value. And as you work further away into the background, you're going to have less contrast and value. I'm taking the liberty here as well to add some additional colors that aren't necessarily evident in the photo reference, just to create a little bit more brightness in the image. This is one of the drawbacks to working on black paper. You really do have to push to make those bright colors really stand out against the darker surface. But even though we're working on a dark surface, you can see that I'm still going back with the indigo blue and filling in those dark sections. So I'm not allowing the black of the paper to be the dark areas. It's just influencing the colors that I'm adding. Instead, I'm using that dark indigo or that indigo blue in those areas to create those negative spaces. This will result in a colored pencil drawing where the entire surface is covered with some type of colored pencil material. As we continue to develop the feathers, at this point in the drawing, we have a pretty good technique for doing this. So we have a good understanding of the colors that we need to use and the order in which we need to apply them in order to create the illusion. And this is something that you'll discover as you continue to create colored pencil drawings, especially when you have something that repeats within an image. Often the first section that you tackle, you're doing a little bit of experimentation, you're trying different colors, and you're trying to see what works. But as you go through the drawing, once you have a good understanding, things speed up a little bit and you can work in each section a lot quicker because you have basically a methodology of applying the colors. So when you're first starting a colored pencil drawing and you have a section that you're trying to tackle, be patient and experiment a little bit and understand that it's going to take you a little bit longer to tackle those early sections of the drawing. But understand that as you have a better understanding of how these colors are going to behave on the surface, you can work a little bit faster as you go through the process. This part of the drawing definitely was a lot faster than the first feather, even though it's more complex because I had a better understanding of the colors that I needed to use. So here in this section, I'm drawing some of the lines that I see, and I'm allowing these colors to change and shift a little bit by adding, again, colors that are similar or analogous to the colors that I've added. So I've started with kind of a pink, a light pink. I've added a little bit more of a red purple that's still a light value, and a little bit of orange and red. So all of these colors are pretty much analogous to each other on the color wheel. Then I'm going back with some light and dark values to create additional contrast and additional depth in the color. And in any drawing that you create, remember that you're the artist. You don't have to replicate a photo reference exactly. You can explore different color combinations and maybe create different color schemes or make colors vibrate off of each other that aren't necessarily there in the reference photo. So don't forget that you're an artist and you can deviate from the photo reference that you're working on. And at this point in the drawing, we've worked our way down to the small remaining section of the paper. And again, we're going to continue the same process, layering colors on the surface. Now, you'll see that I added a little bit of green in this section, and I used this green in some of the yellow sections because it dulled the color down a little bit and made it look a little bit more realistic. So I would describe the color, that orange color, as kind of a dulled sunburst color, but I discovered that layering a little bit of the yellow green over the top of the yellowed orange made a color that looked pretty natural. It's not an exact match, but it's a pretty natural color, and it kind of worked a little bit more with those colors that I'm trying to exaggerate, those purples, greens, and oranges. And just to kind of echo what I said a minute ago about not following your reference exactly, in a drawing like this especially, you could get wrapped up in trying to replicate every single tiny little line that you see. And while it's a good idea to try to replicate what you see as much as possible in a reference, you also have to give yourself freedom to be a little bit different from the reference as well. So if you try to replicate every single feather, some folks out there are going to try to count each one of those lines and try to replicate it. You're just going to drive yourself crazy, and you're going to lose the enjoyment of creating and drawing. So look for patterns and look at how they repeat and try to create a pattern in your drawing that is similar to what you see in the reference photo, and you'll be able to create a convincing illusion. Remember, no one's going to see your reference photo in the end. They're only going to see your finished artwork, and ultimately, that's what matters most. You can see as we finish up the drawing, I'm adding a bit of indigo blue into those dark sections at the bottom, those negative spaces, and then I went back and enhanced some orange sections a little bit further. Then the drawing was complete, and it was time to take away the tape, pulling at a 90-degree angle to minimize tearing. And here's a look at the completed colored pencil drawing on black paper.
Thanks so much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Now, this video series is part of our membership program over at thevirtualinstructor.com. You can see the entire process of creating this drawing from start to finish. Every stroke of the process is recorded in real time so you can follow along. To learn more about our membership program, which includes all of our courses, classes, weekly live lessons, ebooks, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers, just click on the QR code on your screen or check out the link in the description below. If you want to just check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, there's also a link in the description below for that as well. That will put you on our mailing list so I can send you all kinds of free art lessons. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and click on that notification bell so you're notified when new videos like this are posted. If you like this video, give it a like. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.